Welcome everyone to CG seminar number 154, and I think it's about our 40th webinar since the pandemic began. Today we've got surviving a crisis, resilience, adaptation and transformation in higher education after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a most traumatic event for higher education and science in the Soviet zone, which has necessitated a long, slow process of rebuilding, much understudied and very important because this is a big chunk of the world, the former Soviet zone, Russia and the other countries in the USSR. There's a great deal of human resources there committed to education and science, a lot of activity, and in the long term, it will become more and more important in the world again, you would think. Emma Sabzalieva is our presenter today. I'll introduce her in a moment, but let me just take you through the web protocols. Now, as you know, if you've tuned in before, the webinar is being recorded and winds up on YouTube within about 48 hours. We also post the chat from today's webinar online as well. Now, please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar. I don't think it does a great deal of harm if you have it on, but there's a view, I think, that it may interfere with the bandwidth capacity, and on the whole, it's better to have it off. But of course, you can turn it on when you're asking a question. We recommend using speaker view so you can more clearly see who is talking. To ask a question, use the chat function and build your questions in the chat function during the second half of the speaker and into the Q&A session. The questions that come in early are most likely to be selected for participation verbally in the Q&A part of the webinar. So do come in early. We find that people crowd in the last 10 minutes and then tend to miss out for some of the best questions. So write out your question in chat. When we reach the end of the speaker's presentation, we'll then go to the Q&A, and I'll invite people in on the webinar, but I'll give you a warning if you're about to be invited in through the chat function. So keep an eye on that if you've submitted a question. When you're invited in, you please unmute yourself, most important. Switch on your video so we can see you, and state your name and where you are from. So Emma Sabzalieva is a research associate at York in Toronto in Canada. She's the holder of a 2020 prize for newer researchers from the Society for Research into Higher Education. That's the UK SRHE. Her current research is on the new geopolitics of higher education, an area which many of us are working on. Institutional and organizational change in higher education and education in the former Soviet space. So the floor is yours, Emma, and we expect you'll present for up to 30 minutes and then we'll move to Q&A.
Great, thanks so much, Simon. I will just get myself set up and then we'll go. I'm going to assume everybody can see my slides unless somebody waves a virtual hand at me in some way. Good. Great. So thanks so much, everybody, for being here today. And a huge thank you to the Centre for Global Higher Education for hosting the seminar. This was something that we were hoping to do in person, but actually the opportunity to do it online means that I can stay in my house in Toronto, where I'm calling in from today. But it also means that I know we've got people joining us from all over the world, not just in the UK. So it's wonderful to be able to expand and to be able to share my work with you all. So thank you very much for having me. So you don't have to look far to find a crisis in higher education.
Welcome, Trevor. May I introduce Audrey, Selena, Alexis.
Sorry, we've got somebody else's volume on the background.
I'm having a senior moment. Our amazing.
Trevor,
are we there? We're good.
Trevor is our bouncer. He takes care of those interruptions. They do happen.
Well, I was quite curious to see who that was going to be joining us, but let me start again. So you don't have to look far to find a crisis in higher education. And no, I don't mean your Zoom calls being interrupted. Whether we're talking about liberal arts education in the US, whether it's the crisis of how higher education is financed through, and student protests through Fees Must Fall in South Africa, through student protests in Venezuela, whether we're talking about the climate crisis and its impact on higher education, the implications of academic freedom and risks to that, and that being framed as a crisis, and of course the current coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic that we're all living through. There are 2 points that I want to make by going through this list of different kinds of crises. The first, as you can see, is that the idea of what a crisis in higher education is can be applied in a number of different ways. So the next thing I'm going to do in the presentation is talk about how I conceptualize this notion in my research. And secondly, while in my doctoral work, I studied the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 as an example of a crisis. When I finish the presentation, I want to try and make some connections with other forms of crisis to think about what we can learn from that post-Soviet experience and what we can learn about how higher education, what it takes for higher education to survive a crisis. So in the presentation, I'm going to use the words crisis and also major institutional change fairly interchangeably to explain and think about the type of transformation that we're dealing with here. So by institution, within that framing of major institutional change, I mean what political scientists and sociologists talk about as the rules of the game in a society. So the rules that define expected behavior. That can be tangibly through laws, through regulations, but it can also be more broad, so through ideas, through norms, and through values. So a useful analogy when we're thinking about major institutional change is this concept of an avalanche. It's fast moving, it's highly disruptive, and the consequences are far reaching. So here we have, with the fall of the Soviet Union, while we do see the undercurrents of change existing before the eventual collapse in 1991, when it did happen, it was fast and it was largely unexpected. Major institutional change is highly disruptive. It leads to extreme economic shifts. It often can lead to political change, maybe regime change even, and it has far-reaching social implications. And whereas I said major institutional change happens infrequently, its consequences are major both in the short and the long term. So that's how I'm thinking about this concept of crisis or major institutional change. So that sort of provided the rationale for my study. This is the question that I asked in my PhD thesis. How did higher education in Central Asia respond to the fall of the Soviet Union? So the rationale then, as I've explained, is that this moment in 1991 is a fairly rare instance that can be defined as major institutional change. So what you might expect to happen when something as transformative and as major as that happens is that higher education as a social institution within that kind of broader institutional environment will also change radically as a result of the crisis. But actually what I found in my PhD work was that we do have examples of major transformations, but these are accompanied by adaptation and by resilience as well. And so later on, I'll talk a little bit about each of those three themes in terms of transformation, of adaptation, and resilience. What I want to start by doing is just giving you an overview of how I framed and organized the study. Theoretically, I worked with new institutional theory. I found that to be a very appropriate way of setting work and ideas into context. That for me is very important in my work. And as a set of theories, it helps us to understand how organizations adapt to, but also shape their environments. It's very well established in the disciplinary fields of political science and sociology that are kind of key guiding areas for my work. But I think we also, for those of us working in higher education research, we also see new institutional theory increasingly used within studies in higher education as well. So one thing, though, that I found when I started to work with the theory was this challenge that I've raised here. New institutional theory is very good at helping us to understand what you could think of as incremental shifts. So these day-to-day changes that you might not even see when you look at them at that kind of level, but actually which over time do cause change. And those are often premised on happening in fairly stable environments. So the question then that I had was, how well can we use the theory to help think about the impact of major institutional change in non-stable environments? So for me, that was a challenge that I chose to take up by continuing to work with this theory in my thesis. And the innovation then that brings is the application of new institutional theory, and more specifically 3 paradigms within it. So I looked at rational choice, new institutionalism, historical new institutionalism, and sociological new institutionalism, which I'm very happy to talk more about in the Q&A afterwards. But it's the application and the comparison of those 3 theoretical paradigms to support a more holistic understanding of change and continuity in response to the fall of the Soviet Union. So in terms of how the research was organized and designed, I took a period starting with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, and I carried it forward roughly to around 2005. There's no precise endpoint, but it's sort of to enable the study of the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union, and particularly looking at that kind of early first half of the 1990s. But what I also found is that the further that you go into the 2000s, the harder it is to make connections between the effects and the things that we're seeing happen in higher education and the fall of the Soviet Union. So that sort of explains the time period there. It's a comparative case study. So the comparison comes on the one hand through the comparison of the 3 theoretical lenses, which I just mentioned, but it's also a case study of 3 ex-Soviet countries, about which I'll say just a few words shortly. And within those countries, I looked at 2 different levels. So I looked at higher education at the system level. So I'm conceptualizing that as a national higher education system. And I looked at that at an organizational level, which is the individual universities which within those systems. And you can see one of them in the picture here. And I should just say that when I talk about university, I mean not just universities, but those of you who are familiar with the former Soviet space know that as well as universities, there are a lot of specialized institutes which don't teach every subject, but will specialize in maybe 1 or 2 different ones. And I'm also including in that conceptualization the Academy of Sciences. So here in the presentation, I'm using university as a shorthand. The primary way that I collected information for the study was through interviews with 36 very experienced and wonderful human beings, academics who have experience of working either in Soviet era universities, so those founded during the Soviet period, and or those who had experience of working in universities that were founded after the fall of the Soviet Union. I additionally drew fairly heavily on descriptive statistics, and that was particularly useful when I was looking at system change. So at that level, I looked at policy documents and I looked at university websites. So the 3 ex-Soviet countries that I looked at are the Central Asian states of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan that you can see on the map here and on the insert. If you're unfamiliar with the region, there they are in their global space. So I was drawn to looking at these 3 countries in part because of my previous professional experience, having started my working career almost 20 years ago now in the region, and having retained very strong professional and personal connections and engagement with the region since then. So from that kind of starting point, understood that these are 3 countries which would make for a very interesting comparative case study. The map, you can see that they share this sort of geopolitical space. But it's also some of the aspects of the Soviet legacy that all 3 countries inherited, which was of interest. So again, from the map, you can see their borders. Those are borders that each of those countries obtained with independence for the first time in 1991. So there's a whole sort of narrative here about nation building and nation formation, which has to happen after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the other aspect of the Soviet legacy, which isn't so visible from the map, is the impact of the formalization of higher education during the Soviet period, which takes place between the 1920s up until the end of that period. And this isn't to say that there isn't education happening in the region prior to the Soviet period. There is, and it's an incredibly rich and interesting and deep history, which I would encourage you to explore. But what's interesting about the Soviet period is the way that it sort of uniformly creates a system which all 3 countries inherited. And it's that puzzle really which helped drive forward the study. So in 1991, these 3 countries inherit ostensibly a fairly similar starting point. So how then can we explain and understand the differences in higher education which have unfolded since? And there's kind of a counter puzzle to that as well. So given the differences that exist between the 3 countries, how can we understand some of the similarities in the way that higher education has developed since the fall of the Soviet Union? So I know we have a number of people joining us today from all sorts of different backgrounds. So I just wanted to say, before I move in and talk a little bit about what I found in the study, just very briefly, some of the key characteristics of that higher education system and of that legacy that was inherited in 1991. So the Soviet higher education system was centralized. Governance, in terms of how it was funded, in terms of how planning took place. And that level of centralization also leads to a high level of standardization. Universities teaching philosophy in one republic will be sharing the same curriculum as universities teaching philosophy in another republic. And within each of the 15 republics of the Soviet Union, all of which are now, as you know, independent states, there would be, higher education would be sort of structured in a similar way. So there would be a couple of universities, more depending on the size of the republic, but the primary group would be specialist higher education institutions. Higher education in the Soviet period was vital to the economy. I think we could go as far as saying that higher education was inextricably linked to the state. The purpose then of higher education was to train workers to fulfill the demands of the command economy of the Soviet period. And that also tells us a lot as well about how ideologically driven the higher education system was. As a system, it was very highly developed. So in one example here, higher education achieves what we can think of as mass participation. So that's when about 15% of the eligible age group is going on into higher education as early as the 1960s. And that's far earlier than most other places in the world. And I think what we could say from that is by the time we get to 1991, the concept of education is so well established that it can be considered a cultural norm. So it's not just that everybody goes to school and continues on, but it's that if you want to go to higher education, the opportunities are there, and you could, if you work hard enough, go to whichever university or institute you wanted to, on paper, of course. So that's kind of how I structured the study. That's how I'm thinking, just to sort of give you an idea of how I then went into this. So what I want to do now is talk about each of those three themes in turn and give you a little flavor of some of the things that I found. Obviously, it's a PhD thesis. It's 5 years of work. I can't talk about everything today, but I just want to give a kind of brief snapshot over the next few minutes, and then very happy to take up any questions, comments that you have afterwards. So let's start by thinking about transformation at the system level. And then what you'll also see in these slides going forward is, because this was a qualitative study that's based on interviews, I've got some short excerpts from some of my respondents to kind of give flavor to the points that I want to make here. So the big picture story in terms of how the systems are transformed is this expansion. It's massive. So in the space of 15 years, the three countries' systems grow by between around 200 to 300%. And that is just, you know, it's a remarkable story, and one that's sort of worth dwelling on a bit. In part, that growth in the number of universities in the system is driven by privatization. And that is another really big story, a big transformation in the way that higher education is organized, from the Soviet period, where there were no tuition fees, where it's ostensibly without cost, to a system where in 92 and 93, each of the three countries I studied legalized tuition fees. It creates a framework in which new universities can emerge, and those can be privately run. They can earn their income, their operating sources, from tuition fees and other private sources. So as the respondent in Kazakhstan here says, in 1991, we still had nothing. And that's thinking about, you know, the real tumult that emerges from the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the president nevertheless opened the first private university, and, you know, it really speaks to the enormity and the magnitude of a task like that. So thinking about how then that transformation goes through into universities, and here I was focused on universities that were founded during the Soviet period, but to see then, you know, what organizational changes, normative shifts took place after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And again, that expansion narrative comes through both in terms of their size and their scope. So one of the really remarkable changes that happened was that whole new faculties were created to account for fee-paying students. So whilst many students were still able to come through higher education being funded by the state, which is the same as in the previous model, we see new faculties like agro-business, like ethno-pedagogy, and so on, coming through for fee-paying students. And as this respondent in Kyrgyzstan says, we survived for a long time on account of these faculties, those where the income was coming from, in the absence of funding coming from the state at a time of economic chaos and crisis. So another sort of interesting connection to that is it also links to the privatization narrative, but here we're seeing privatization happening in the public sector. So these Soviet era universities are state universities or public universities, but they're privatizing from the inside. It also shows us how far we move away from the shift from the supply side, education, economy connection of the Soviet period to a more demand driven, where universities are creating these faculties to meet the demand or the perceived new demands of students. So that's one area there. Another sort of key point of transformation in Soviet era universities is the newfound ability to engage with outside and international actors. And so structurally, you see changes like international offices being created, new senior leadership positions coming on stream to support universities structurally in that. I've mentioned here the Open Society Foundation. So in my study, I sort of pick out a couple of key international actors who for different reasons are sort of impacted in the way that higher education has since evolved. I mentioned the so-called Soros Foundation here as a key actor, because on the one hand, it's kind of recognized as an actor in the current literature, but I think the role that it has played is much more transformative than we currently understand. So that's kind of saying, I think there is more work that we can do there. And I think particularly with the ongoing relevance and politicization of the role of the Open Society Foundation in higher education, that will be a very important way, very important area to move forwards. So those are kind of some thoughts there about the transformation. You also see a number of things happening, which I think are more aligned to the idea of adaptation. So where changes are happening in order to adapt to the shifting environment, rather than with the previous findings where the changes are actually shaping what that environment looks like as well. So these are changes that largely replicate sort of previous models and functions in higher education, which one of my respondents talked about here as division and multiplication. So where you have existing universities, you might find in some instances that faculties are branching off or coming to become independent organizations. You also see, particularly in Kazakhstan and in Kyrgyzstan, this idea of multiplication where universities open domestic branch campuses in other parts of the country. So that does have implications for the number of universities in the system, the location of those universities, but it doesn't substantively affect the function of higher education. The other aspect here that I want to talk about in terms of adaptation is changes to the content, not the structure, but the content of the curriculum. So bringing in new subjects like cultural studies, sociology was another one that people talked about. And national histories could seem like a major shift, but what I found in the course of my study was that actually, although I wanted to start thinking about these changes from 1991, you also have to kind of go back a few years and think about the preceding period called perestroika of the late 1980s. And for curriculum, that's relevant because there are a lot of shifts there and work starting to happen on changes to the curriculum, which then lay the groundwork for the shifts to come. So that's one reason why I've sort of included it in this idea of adaptation rather than transformation. And the other is sort of because this is more of a pragmatic response. So as the respondent here asks, well, what should we teach in philosophy? Earlier we were taught Marxism, but now what? So that points to the kind of delegitimization of the previous ideological basis for much of the curriculum, particularly in the social sciences and the humanities. And so if, you know, previously you taught history of the USSR because that was the national history course that you had to teach, and you're no longer in a nation called the USSR, then you need to switch that to teach something else, a history of Kazakhstan or history of Tajikistan or something else instead. So I think that's kind of more of a pragmatic shift that has to take place in response to what's going on around. So the third theme that I found was one of resilience. So here we're thinking about more than just sort of persistence, but actually the ability to withstand pressure or damage. And there are two kind of areas that I want to focus on here. So the first is organizational culture. And what I found from talking to respondents is that the value that's placed on long service, on an in-depth organizational understanding, really persists through. So bearing in mind that I was interviewing people a couple of years ago and asking them to reflect back on a period, and most of those are still working or still had connections with higher education, including one respondent who was among the first students to be at a new university that was founded in the mid-1950s, and with the exception of a few years of postgraduate study, had worked their way through that organization right up to the very top. So had this sort of 60-year institutional history. And that was very meaningful for respondents. I think you can also then extrapolate from that it also leads to resistance, because if you have the same people working in the same organization, the same university, the opportunity then to significantly change that organizational culture is diminished. The other point here is about the value of higher education. So I mentioned before that you can consider higher education to be sort of a fairly well-established cultural norm, and I think that still persists. You do see that change, and so there's now a discourse around, quality. Is the quality of higher education diminishing, and that kind of thing? But I think you can actually see that as something which is reflective of the high esteem that higher education is still held in, that we now have a conversation about, is it still good enough? How can we make it better? So I think that is a sort of a norm of value that still persists. And the other point here is about the continuation, the persistence of what the university is, and the Soviet era idea of what a university is has continued. And in the study, I looked at a number of new universities that had been founded after 1991 and sort of typologized those into different groups. One of those was, as I call here, neo-Soviet universities. And so as the respondent in Tajikistan here speaks to, well, the new university was open, but it was like the Soviet system. So it kind of functioned in the same way, it was organized in the same way, it offered similar courses. So I think there you see resilience coming through at a different level. So as I said, I can't, speak in very much detail about each of those findings or any of the other findings in more detail, but just to give you an idea of what I mean when I say that, you can have these very different responses to the fall of the Soviet Union. So in terms of, what does the study add? What do we learn from that? I think there's 4 points that I'd like to make here. So in the new institutional literature, so the theoretical grounding of the literature, there tends to be it's not quite extreme, but there tends to be an approach that says, if you have a crisis, either everything changes as a response to that crisis, or in fact, the scale of the crisis is so much that it prohibits anything from changes. And what this study has done, I think, is add some nuance to that. So rather than saying, well, it's either all or nothing, we can really understand and get into some of the complexities and some of the nuance between that. What I haven't been able to do, particularly in this presentation, is talk more about the comparison between the three countries, but that nuance is part of that story as well. Secondly, where we do have a fairly good body now of literature on higher education in the former Soviet space, and that's both in the English language and the Russian language that I'm able to engage with. What my study is able to do is kind of affirm some of those empirical findings, but also move that forward by not necessarily just focusing on the what changed, but to look at how and why. And so really with this focus on normative, organizational, and structural aspects of higher education as well. I think the comparison here, thirdly, helps us to look at different ways of dealing with legacies in higher education. And so that's particularly important when you're looking at major change, where there is, a regime shift. And in the context of the former Soviet space, where higher education was so closely connected to the state, looking at how the countries have kind of managed that and dealt with that moving forwards helps us to understand the extent to which higher education still is connected to the state, or the extent to which it's become delinked from this previous very state-centric model. And the fourth point here is about the perspective that the study provides by centering the stories and the lived experiences of academics who are, as those of you who are also faculty members know, on the front line of higher education. Now that focus in itself isn't new. We have many studies in higher education which use faculty voices, But I think what's significant about the way that it's done in this study is the different perspective that it provides. We do see often in studies of the former Soviet space an emphasis on the policy side, on the government, and that's understandable given all the things that I've said about how important higher education has been to the state. But I think looking at these changes through the lenses of individuals and their portrayal of reality and how they construct that helps us to take that new perspective on this historic period. And it does so in a region in Central Asia that is too often marginalized. So, you know, for me, this is an opportunity through the study to bring forward these voices and to help others see what I have seen before about the importance of really thinking about the knowledge and the understanding that we can learn from Central Asian academics. And finally, I think on this point, I think where you're looking at contexts like Tajikistan, where academic freedom is increasingly constrained, it becomes even more important to be able to share the voices of people who are working from within that system. So finally, what does it take to survive a crisis? That's how I've set the talk up. Obviously, there's no magic formula. There's no, easy answer to that. And I think something that's really important to take into consideration is the different contexts. So, everything that I've just talked about relates to the fall of the Soviet Union. So what I'm not trying to say is you could pick this study up and easily apply it to understanding crisis or major institutional change in other environments. What I am saying, though, is perhaps there are some different elements from that we could take and try to apply in other ways. We can see from the experience of the Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan higher education there, higher education, and we know this from other studies as well, is very durable, but it isn't immune to change. The fact that we can see transformation and adaptation and resilience all happening helps to kind of underpin that point. Here, I think we can also think about what does this crisis moment present to us? And I don't want to sort of make some flippant remark about, wasting a good crisis, something like that. That's not what I mean at all. But what I do mean is that when this shock to the system of higher education happens, it does present a moment where we can think about and take stock of the path that that higher education system or that organization is on and try to consider whether there are ways that this could be reimagined. Are we content with the direction that higher education is going in? How could we use this as a way of trying to, move higher education onto a different track, for example? And that's certainly something which in my subsequent research after this doctoral study, I've tried to take forward as an idea as well. And then finally, for those of you who are doing your research in higher education, I think what I've learned is there's certainly more space for work on how higher education responds to non-stable environments and therefore to crisis. And, we're all living through this current pandemic. We can conceptualize this as a different form of crisis. And I think coming out from this, there's going to be a lot of scope for thinking about how that impacts on higher education and how higher education responds to that. I grounded my study using new institutional theory and these different lenses within it. There were certainly some interesting moments in that journey, but I know that there are ongoing kind of arguments, complaints that higher education as a field is under theorized and we could do more on that. So I certainly think that there's scope to continue to refine and to develop these lenses, taking maybe a comparison of different new institutional lenses, or maybe taking one and working how we can make that, refine that for higher education studies. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much. I also want to say, I know that there are some of the 36 amazing people that I interviewed watching today, and I just want to reiterate again my thanks and my gratitude to them for helping me and for really, being open to sharing their stories and to helping me to drive forward this research. So I'm going to hand back to Simon and look forward to your questions and to your comments.
Well, thank you, Emma. Very articulate presentation with great slides, and you have been a webinar star today because we've had almost 100 people checking into this topic.
Wow.
And that's almost double what we had on Tuesday for the US elections. So maybe the world's media is covering the wrong region and should be focusing on Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan at the moment instead of the United States of America. We've got a lot of questions. I'm going to ask you one first, and then we've got Maya David Sheena. I'll be asking Sheena's question for her because she doesn't have a microphone. Beyond that, I've got on my list Yulia, David Law, Helen, Simon, Rukashon, and Aki and Hage. So we won't get them all in, but we'll do our best, and I'll go straight to my question. You're absolutely right to focus on this region. It's very important and understudied. And as you said, and one of the things that's interesting about the post-Soviet zone is the unique political economy in higher education that emerged. And you've got this situation where most governments in the post-Soviet zone continue to maintain free places as they did in the Soviet time for people on the basis of academic merit. And that the size of that free place component, what you might call the public good component, varies by country, but it's like in Russia itself, it's about half of the entry. So it's quite large. And there's also a second market-based component, which you referred to, and you said the commercial sector kept things going and so on in the early stages, which of course was true when the government funding collapsed. The market-based sector helped the higher education systems to survive. So you've got this double system, you know, sort of pure Soviet and pure post-Soviet market-based alongside each other. Is that happening in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan? What kind of tensions does that create?
It's a really great observation, and it gives me a chance maybe to say a little bit more about the differences between the three countries. It wasn't something I could emphasize so much in the presentation today. So one thing I should say about privatization is by 2005, which is just 15 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, not only do we have this huge growth in the size of the higher education systems in each of the three countries, but in Kazakhstan, you actually have 65% of all universities operating as private universities within 15 years of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the system overall has shifted to becoming more private than public. Now, since then, there's been a number of changes I'm not going to go into today, and other people know about much better than I do. In Kyrgyzstan, though, that shift between private and public is also fairly dramatic. By 2005, a third of all higher education institutions are private. In Tajikistan, though, none are by 2005. There's some small and minor experimentation with private higher education, but what you see in Tajikistan, and there's a whole other kind of important story to tell there, because there's a civil war that takes place from 92, kind of goes through until 97. And what you see there is the government sort of effectively taking back control of higher education, so that by 2005, the domestic higher education system has been re-nationalized. So that's even before you get into this question about fees and non-fee paying places. So I think just to give kind of a snapshot, really, that's a key area of difference between the three countries. And I know perhaps people who are listening may be more familiar with the Russian context. So if you know about sort of how Russian higher education has developed, you see a lot of parallels with what's happened in Kazakhstan. Kyrgyzstan, I think, where you talk about, having these, it's almost like having two systems side by side, and that effect really is visible in Kyrgyzstan, which of the three countries has been the more open consistently to international partnerships and international influence in a less, kind of coercive and tangible way. So you have this sort of so-called Soviet era system with state-funded places, but you also have a kind of more marketized, market-based system with students paying fees. And so in all three countries, you have those two things happening. But in Kyrgyzstan, what you really feel is that it's a bit more kind of, it's not really knitted together particularly, but the systems, they exist, they're there, it functions, people get through, they graduate. So it's kind of an interesting proposition as well, I think.
And I think you can make a larger argument that the post-Soviet zone as a whole is still somewhere between the Soviet era and whatever's going to follow.
I think you could also make an argument it's not necessarily on sort of a linear transition, and yes, that Kyrgyzstan case, really points out, really sort of helps us to understand that as well, I think. So it's not just kind of Soviet to capitalist by any means, or communist to capitalist, or however you want to kind of position it. So it's kind of, it's certainly starting point with one thing, but where it's going to from that could go in multiple different directions.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's most unclear. And it's only a generation ago. Can we bring in Maya Chankseliani at this stage? Maya.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma, for an absolutely fantastic presentation. I have a question. I will kind of try to make it slightly more nuanced now. So I wonder, I have not read your dissertation, obviously, but I wonder how much evidence did you see of the role of international and supranational actors in these transformations, and in which areas they contributed and how they contributed to the transformation. Just to differentiate what I mean by international and supranational. By international, I would mean kind of different countries, universities from those countries, for example, Russia, the UK, the USA, etc. By supranational, I would mean philanthropic organizations or international organizations, the OSF that you mentioned, Aga Khan Foundation, for example, the World Bank, the European Commission, etc., etc. So did you see much evidence of those sectors, supranational and international, contributing to these transformations, and in which areas? Is it more institutional development, more higher education policy, more kind of individual opportunities and scholarships, or something else? Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. It's nice to see you, Maya, as well. So one of the, I kind of talked about the main research question that I looked at in the study, which was this rather big and, ongoing one about how higher education responds to major institutional change. One of the sub-research questions I had did specifically focus on the role of international actors. And I did that to look at, because these international actors hadn't been able to be part of the higher education scene prior to 1991. So then my thinking was that if you looked at the Soviet era universities and then you examine the extent to which they become internationalized or engage internationally, that helps us to think about the extent to which changes have happened that can be connected to the fall of the Soviet Union and, the literal creation and opening of borders. So it was a question that I talked about with all the respondents, and I kind of expected some of the supranationals like your World Bank, like the International Monetary Fund, to come up, and they very rarely did. And that I thought was quite surprising. I will sort of leave it at that and say, because you're very familiar with the literature, and we know that when we talk about, the sort of Central and Eastern Europe, and we talk about the shift away from communism, those are two main actors who come up again and again. So I was kind of expecting more people to talk about them, and they didn't. And that might be because I was talking with faculty members, some of whom had administrative responsibilities in their universities and some of whom didn't. So it may be that what you're looking at is the engagement on that individual level. And that might be one of the reasons that the Open Society Foundation came up as such a prominent actor. But to me, that's very interesting because it's a huge international organization. We know that Soros is interested in higher education in a range of different national and regional contexts. But actually, the way that kind of transforms higher education is through individuals. So through being able to fund somebody to go to a summer school to learn about Benedict Anderson and imagined communities. That was one of the examples that was given. And for that person to then come back and start teaching it, and for that to then ultimately affect how the curriculum is organized, for that then to ultimately affect what courses are offered. So you really see it's almost like kind of top-down and bottom-up change happening at the same time. The other international actor that came up as significant, which wasn't really an international actor until 1991, is Russia. And I kind of feel like in the presentation, Russia is a bit of an elephant in the room in the sense that it's there, but in different ways. And you do see a very differential effect. And Iveta Silova, in some of her earlier work, has talked about how Kazakhstan moved very quickly to become a donor-free environment. So not reliant on Russia, not reliant on Soros to support higher education, but instead using its own resources to push forward changes. So the impact of Russia on higher education in Kazakhstan has been significantly different from how it has been come through in Kyrgyzstan and in Tajikistan, for example.
Thank you both. David Mills.
So thank you very much. I've really enjoyed that, Emma. It was really interesting. I mean, lots of things I'd like to ask you about sociological neo-institutionalism, but I will just follow on because I did say I would ask about OSF. You answered that question quite well. So I'll just push back a little bit more. Obviously, privatization is a big part of the narrative. Even if people themselves couldn't trace the origins of that policy development, could you comment on where that sort of sudden push and energy came from? What sort of international influences led to the immediate sort of opening up of a private sector, or was it indigenous? I mean, if you can sort of explain a bit more about that, that'd be great.
That's a really interesting question. One of the things that I do in the thesis is give various case studies of new universities that emerged after 1991 to try and trace that story in a bit more of a micro detail, because it's quite difficult, I think, to pull out. It's always the difficulty, I think, isn't it, when you do qualitative research, to sort of say, here's what I found about this, you know, beautiful, wonderful, interesting context, and here's how we generalize from that to try and take other things. So it's a little bit difficult, I think, to do that on the basis of individual stories. But one of the, you know, you mentioned sociological new institutionalism. So one of the concepts within that lens is this idea of the institutional entrepreneur. So people who are positioned and have enough power and agency to be the ones that bring forward change. And it is sometimes, you know, so some of the stories that I have, there's an example of the American University of Central Asia and Kyrgyzstan. If you look at the sort of founding story of that, you really can tie that back to one person. And in that sense, this conceptualization of the institutional entrepreneur, you know, for those of you unfamiliar, it doesn't mean they're off going to try and make money or anything like that necessarily, but it's about kind of their vision and the way that they're able to kind of mobilize support, mobilize people. So in that case, the American University of Central Asia actually starts life as, you know, a small faculty within a Soviet era university. And then, you know, over time gets support from the US Embassy, it gets support from, here he is again, the Soros Foundation. And, you know, fairly quickly becomes more than just the American faculty. It becomes a university, it becomes the American University of Kyrgyzstan, and now has blossomed into the American University of Central Asia, and it still exists, and it's incredibly successful as a model. So perhaps that's one kind of way that I could respond to the question that you had.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Again, thank you both. Now, Sheena Bell has a question, but she can't deliver it herself because she doesn't have a mic, so I'm going to read it for her.
Okay.
You mentioned that there were 3 theoretical lenses to help you understand rapid institutional change. Can you speak briefly as to the insights from those theories in your research findings? So everyone wants to talk about their theoretical base when they're talking about their doctorate. So this is a good opportunity.
Well, I don't know, I'm quite excited about the empirical findings as well, but happy to talk about the theory. So one of my committee members, you know, called me eclectically polite for having taken on board these 3 lenses to try and really sort of interrogate them a little bit further. And, you know, would always push me and say, well, which one, Emma? Of the 3 lenses, you know, I think, and increasingly interestingly, I'm starting to see among other scholars who look at the former Soviet space and look at higher education in that space, the use of historical new institutionalism. So that carries with it concepts like path dependency. And for the former Soviet systems, you know, you see some of these areas of resilience that I talk about. That seems to be quite a good, you know, way of helping us to understand the weight, if you like, of the legacy that's brought forward, and how even if, you know, imagine you're on this kind of linear path, even if something like, as you know, the fall of the Soviet Union comes onto it, the path nevertheless, after a small break, and, you know, then again, we've got the concept there of the critical juncture, continues on. So path dependency, historical new institutionalism, I think has some quite compelling explanatory power. In my study, that particularly held up strongly in the case of Tajikistan, where I've already talked about, you know, the effective renationalization of the domestic higher education system. Sociological new institutionalism, I think, is more widely used in higher education studies, particularly when we're thinking about the impact of globalization and globalizing processes on higher education. So concepts like isomorphism, so saying, well, these kind of a limited number of ideas which are swirling around, which then become accepted to higher education. So that's quite helpful, I think, when we're thinking about norms and values. So particularly, you know, not necessarily the written rules about how higher education operates, but how does it come to be that you see some fairly similar effects in different places? And rational choice new institutionalism, which, you know, assumes that humans and actors are, as it suggests, fairly rational in the way that they make decision, was actually quite helpful in understanding some of the responses to change in the very immediate period after the fall of the Soviet Union. So many public sector workers simply didn't get any salary at all from the state. You know, the states are shifting into recession, hyperinflation, economic chaos, economic crisis, and in the case of Tajikistan, civil war as well. So it becomes, in that sense, you know, a fairly logical and rational response that you're going to look in your university to bring on board private fee-paying students, because they're going to replace the income that's not coming from the state anymore. So each of these three lenses, I think, in different ways can help to illustrate different aspects of the change process after 1991.
Thank you, Emma. Julia Gatalina, can you come in, please? Julia.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Emma. Yeah, my name is Julia. I'm a PhD student at Tampere University, Finland, and I'm doing research on the kind of also changes, but in the Russian higher education system. And I wanted to ask, because when you talked about this value in higher education, you briefly mentioned the issue of quality of education, that basically that because we see value in the post-Soviet context, we kind of now there is the argument that quality is decreasing. And my question is exactly about the issue of quality. What do you think actually a quality higher education meant in the Soviet times, and how it changed, like what it now means, what is actually a quality higher education? Thank you.
That's an interesting question. It's not, so I had this sort of semi-structured interview format. So I kind of went in, as you know, with like a series of starting point questions, and then we kind of went from there, depending on, you know, what the respondent wanted to talk about, what they were particularly interested about. So quality of higher education wasn't a question that I came in with, you know, a particular idea of what it was. And I think, again, for me, it was very important not to necessarily impose and say, this is what quality was, this is what good means, or this is what bad means, but just kind of to hear it from participants, to hear it from respondents instead. So one of the things that came up several times in terms of quality was not necessarily what makes good quality, but people were very easily able to identify what they thought didn't make good quality higher education. And there you would often, I think, find some conflation with talking to respondents about what they were experiencing now. And I was doing these interviews in 2017, so very recently. And so I'm kind of driving back to say, okay, think back to this period. And I knew that, you know, that's kind of an issue with the method that I chose to use. You know, you're asking people to think back to a different period. And of course, we've lived through a lot more since then as well. So I wouldn't say it came up sort of specifically, and it wasn't sort of defined as such in terms, but, you know, some people would mention, for example, declining student quality. And they would say, you know, students come to university now and they're less well prepared than they used to be. So there is a certain, I would say, conceptualization of, you know, this in the Soviet system, education was better, it was stronger, it was more rigorous, and that prepared students better to come into higher education. And that is something that has shifted. I'm not saying that, you know, that's true or it's not true, because this is about how people construct their own versions of reality. But that's kind of the main thing that I think I would say when it comes to quality.
Thank you, Julia and Emma. David Law, please.
Thank you, Simon. Congratulations, Emma. Very good presentation. My question is about the material differences between these three countries, because Kazakhstan is so much more prosperous than the other two. And in particular, I'm wondering whether this makes a difference to the way in which T&E starts to develop in the Central Asian region. Outside of your three countries, of course, you have Uzbekistan and the developments in Tashkent. But just briefly, if you can, what kind of difference does the prosperity of Kazakhstan make to its HE system in comparison with your other examples?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good point to raise. It makes a big difference, is the very brief answer to that. Kazakhstan, as it sounds like, you know, has access to significantly more natural resources than do Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Also, if you think back about the map I showed, it's a lot bigger, both in terms of land mass, it's the 9th biggest country in the world, and in terms of population as well. So that differential is one of the puzzles that I talked about, because even though there are, if you want to think about that as a kind of, a head start for Kazakhstan in terms of how it's going to then finance itself. And it's one of the reasons why it is able to become this donor-free environment in a way that Kyrgyzstan hasn't and Tajikistan hasn't, but for different reasons. But even though you have that differential, some of the trends that we see are still similar to the other two countries. So the resources make a difference. but it doesn't explain everything. You mentioned T&E, you mentioned transnational education, and that you see, if you're looking at sort of international universities which is looking to set up branches or other places or other universities in outside of their own settings, again, you would see more of those proportionately in Kyrgyzstan than in Kazakhstan. And I think then you have to start to think about the political factors. So Kyrgyzstan's been held up as being, you know, the most democratic of a fairly non and anti-democratic bunch of countries. And I think that makes a difference for different reasons. So yeah, it's a really interesting question. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think you could make an argument that Kazakhstan's underperforming. I mean, given its GDP per capita position, it's a question of how that GDP, of course, is distributed in the country and the nature of the state. But, you know, internationalization strategy has been very active, very visible, but not enough is flowing through in terms of quality improvement over time. And it's been difficult to recruit and hold people in, despite vigorous efforts made to encourage inward academic movement. People coming in early in their careers are not staying very long. That's my impression. But things may well develop over time. Simon Massacote is our next Q&A participant. Simon, are you there?
Yes. Thank you, Emma, for your presentation. It was really interesting. You already answered a couple of questions about international actors, but I was wondering about your thoughts on the role of Turkey in creating new partnerships, specifically in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. There's at least 2 Kyrgyz university and at least 1 in Kazakhstan. I don't know if there's more. And I was really surprised to see them like thrive in this environment and how early they came into these countries, and their cultural project as well. That their relationship to local culture is also very different from other foreign actors.
Yes, thank you. Simon, you've actually made me pick up my thesis to check a date in there. So I really appreciate that opportunity. Yeah, Turkey is a very important actor in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. And there, that's, you know, you've got linguistic similarities, you've got some cultural overlap and sort of different kind of historical connections than you have with Tajikistan, which is why we don't see very much interaction with Turkey in higher education and in Tajikistan. So I mentioned that when I looked at the new universities that have emerged since 1991 and created these sort of various different models of them, one of the models I looked at was the binational. And so there actually Turkey is a significant actor. And you mentioned, I think, the Kyrgyz Turkish Manas University, and that was founded in 1995 in Kyrgyzstan. So Turkey's actually been, you know, on the higher education scene as an international actor from a fairly early stage. Russia is another you know, key player when it comes to the creation of binational universities. That's perhaps much less surprising given the links and given that, you know, prior to 1991, it wouldn't have been an international connection, but, you know, rather a republic-wide connection. So that, yes, there's other sort of Turkish influence in Kazakhstan and in Kyrgyzstan that goes on. I don't sort of have a count off the top of my head as the number of institutions, but just that example there of the Kyrgyz Turkish University from 95, you know, that's now coming up for 30 years old. So that's pretty well established.
The next question is from Rukashona. Are you there, Rukashona?
Yes, hello, I am. First of all, I would thank you so much for the incredibly comprehensive presentation. My question is rather about the content of the curriculum at the higher education level. And probably my first question is, to what extent the content of the curriculum at the higher education level is still influenced, dominated, and probably even monitored by the states of these countries? And probably a following question to that would be, and how relevant is the content of this curriculum in developing competences and set of skills that are actually on demand in the labor markets of these countries? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very relevant pair of questions, not just for this part of the world, I think, but something that concerns planners all around the world. So the study that I'm talking about today finishes data collection in about 2005. So the extent to which we can talk about what the curriculum does or doesn't do today would be something that we could take up, I think, in a different space. But you also asked about, the extent to which the content is monitored by the state. And I think what was interesting for me to understand is that during that sort of immediate period after the fall of the Soviet Union, what was more controlled by the state was the structure of the curriculum. So the actual content had to be, signed off, but at perhaps a different level. So if you're familiar, or for those of you who are familiar with the Soviet system of higher education, it operates in a 4-block structure, where over the course of your undergraduate study, this is for undergraduate courses, so over the course of that 4 or 5 years, you work through the compulsory subjects. For your course, you work through compulsory subjects that all students take, and then you get into various levels of optional subjects. And that 4-block structure still exists in the higher education system. And what's changed is, the extent to which different subjects fall into different blocks. And some of those compulsory subjects, like I mentioned, history of USSR or, philosophy, which has this Marxist grounding, those have changed. And that, I think, is more of a pragmatic shift, right? In Tajikistan, this is not something that came up in the thesis, but one of the newer actors in higher education is the University of Central Asia. It's the, one of the few private universities. It's not domestically run. There are still no domestic private universities in the countries, but it's an international university. Even that university, which is coming in from the outside, is operating in 3 countries. It's a very unique and interesting model. They still have to teach some of the core courses which all universities in Tajikistan have to teach. And that is a development which is happening today. So I think that's quite an interesting point to make. And there are sort of other things that we could talk about in the context of Tajikistan and the control over the curriculum and the organization of higher education.
Thanks again, Emma, and thank you for the economical and effective way you've answered all the questions. We're going to cheat as we usually do and go slightly over the 3 p.m. UK time spot. And we'll take one more question. I'm going to apologise to Hage, Nazgul, Nino, Olga, Kasila, and Munira. We won't have time for your questions. There's been great questions coming in the last 10 minutes, and this does underline the fact that you need to come in early in these webinars, but I'm sure Emma will be happy to enter into a correspondence around each of those questions, and you can get in touch with her, of course, through York. The question from Aki Yanazawa is our final question.
Thank you very much. I also enjoyed a very comprehensive and discussion. Thank you very much, Emma. And my question is as follows. I am highly interested in the education borrowing theory or the policy borrowing theory, especially in the period of the nation building. The many countries are becoming independent, but actually those 3 countries has a common challenges. So one of the option is that to collaborate each other and influence each other. So that is one option. But it seems that the 3 countries has quite different, diversified in the end. So this, and I'd like to know that what kind of interaction were there or were not, and why it is so.
So what kind of
interaction among each other? So those 3 countries or stakeholders interact each other or collaborate each other to solve the common problem, or do they work independent, separately? And then so that is one question. And the second question is what is the background of that answer?
Yeah, okay, thank you. It's nice to see you as well. So in terms of interaction between the 3 countries, minimal, if it exists at all. And that is, I think a very interesting topic, which others have also taken up in the concept of, political science, when we think about regional integration. So we talk about Central Asia as a regional space, but that's kind of a geopolitical space. If you look at how higher education is organized and the extent to which the countries cooperate to share and, as you talked about, to build expertise, where that happens, as far as I have seen, that's mediated not by the countries themselves, but because of another initiative. So you see some connections now, and again, this is beyond the scope of my study, where I didn't look at the kind of Bologna process and the European series of reforms to create the European higher education area. But now, you know, there is this big kind of policy borrowing trend going on, not just in Central Asia, but across the former Soviet space, in terms of adopting the principles and the models and making reforms to align to the European higher education area. But that is happening not as a result of countries talking to one another, but as a result of kind of alignment with this European model. And in Kazakhstan in particular, in the early 90s, so kind of connecting it back to the aftermath of the Soviet Union, actually what you see is a country that looks for best practice wherever it's found. So the first president of Kazakhstan was, for example, highly influenced by Singapore and by Singapore's economic and political development, and sought to try and emulate that. So that first university, one of the first private ones that was founded in 1991, was kind of partly on that kind of motivation and inspiration, if you like. So I think, you know, because we're out of time, I probably won't say more at this point, but I do think that's this question about integration within the region and the sense of, is there a region, is there a kind of a scope for a higher education community with the region, is a really important one that we should continue to analyze and to try and understand more deeply. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Indeed, and not only the elephant in the room of Russia, but there's also China lurking in the background as well in Central Asia. Aki, you've changed your background. You've gone impressionist on us. Very interesting. So we'll look forward to see what comes out next week. Next Tuesday we have Laureate International, the for-profit model. That's an interesting discussion. Emma, thank you for your contribution to global higher education discussion today, and we look forward to seeing you again in future. So goodbye now to everyone. Tune in next Tuesday for Laureate International.